The use of KKK functions is historically derived by their Confederate militia terrorism, in which case the Confederacy, having been completely destroyed in the Civil War, had to reshape its espionage engagements in its long-term strategies as their contingency to the lost cause position, their lost cause myth being derivative of their claim that they stood no chance if the Union actually engaged in a conflict based upon superior resources, at which point their internal strategies would have to have, by nature, engaged in alternative means of warfare. In case of a collapse of their system, they would have already needed structures and blueprints already arranged to adapt the means of their application of the use of force, in which case you have the overthrow of North Carolina, but when it elected its black members, had been overthrown by the white nationalist Klan members, at which point you have the espionage war as the primary mechanism of the threat, and the application of the diversity, which is wokeism and racism being functionally the same thing, which has engaged in the position of trying to get black and other groups who have been disenfranchised to accept the positions of the white nationalist arrangements, such as segregation. They go in their corner, the rest of us go in our corner, and never the two shall meet, being the normalization, which includes the ghettoization of the inferior opportunities, as well as the white suburban arrangements, which is designed to highly concentrate the separateness of the various groups, which separatist is inherently different than equal, and equal justice under the law becomes impossible as long as you could other the other. And any group that is perceived as other, regardless of the viability of the position, including stripes versus hashtags, would engage in the ability to refer to the arrangements as the other groups, at which point you have the intention of the sports franchise engagement of being aggressive towards the other and highly promoted towards your own team, at which point you have the development of the breakdown of the agreement of the social rule of law, in which case you have the validation of treating them inferior in law, at which point the position is generated for the suppression of the other group through fraud, which increases your ability to engage in leverage against them and their inability to act. And their inability to act is commonly referred to as poverty, and that poverty, barring them from being able to acquire a remedy, qualifies their vulnerability to you and the other groups, at which point their inability to acquire that on the basis of their status makes the position of exploiting the other into systematically removing them while having a pretense of civility which has no functional application in the arrangement, as they are inherently the other, and it is a bigoted exchange in order to abuse them, at which point, knowing that they're rights, there is no impartial third party to enforce the law, and as there is no impartial third party, there is no ability for the person who is being wronged to acquire the remedy when the systematic abuses are specifically designed to prevent the possibility of them being treated competently by the government, which, being infiltrated by the Klan, becomes the second party, and the second party in question generates its various terrorisms, at which point, if you overthrow the government, such as in North Carolina, and you systematically engage in voter fraud through their violence, you have the overall mechanism of the false government, which is constantly breeding the clan by infection. Now, breeding the clan by infection means whenever you acquire the policies you're specifically looking for, as you have already entered into the mechanism of enforcing the general social norms by the government, you have the overpowered ability by infection to destroy the other groups in suppressing of the other groups and the destruction of the resources and the inability of them to acquire safety, which is the point of having a government, is to have the mutual enforcement of rights and laws, which would have otherwise allowed their original prosperity, which is systematically tampered with, at which point you don't have the structural ability to submit the resources, to get the remedy, to be treated equal, at which point you are constantly being degraded as the systematic destruction of the target groups by the wars of attrition engages as a mechanism of politics as war for the bigoted clan, at which point you have terrorist organizations as the functional replacement to law, and thus you don't have law enforcement. You might have cops who are Confederate operating patrol, or the ability to enforce their bigotries or their arbitrary moralities, which is white nationalism. And if you have the enforcement of white nationalism, you have the 1984 arrangement towards the systematic application of whatever arbitrary thing acquires the agenda, at which point it's the means justify the ends, at which point the arguments are irrelevant and discardable information, like Sam Harris's argument of genetic guilt on the basis of one's biology making them biologically guilty, and thus you can justify the torturing of infants for whatever jack-off con you want to pull off, at which point you have the systematic false justification, which is inherently natural to the white nationalist arrangements, which includes the position of black men raping white women as a historic fraud that they would have actively engaged in, and the retort by one of the black leaders during the heyday or high power mechanisms of the white nationalists is that sometimes the white women choose it on purpose, and that is not acceptable. At which point you have the application of the compelled by force separation, at which point the threat of terrorism is designed to separate the groups, as is designed by the poison scripts to enforce the mechanism by their strategies, like if you're playing football, your coaches derive a strategy in order to beat the other team, and they're not supposed to tell the other team. It's basically like that, except it's terrorism and an act of war against an unarmed, undefended population. At which point you have the active enforcing of their bigotries in order to reinforce itself through dogma and historic cultures which are specifically manufactured by their terrorism. At which point you have the normalization through the courts who have been infected by white nationalism. Loyalty to the Klan gives them the position of saying that those who have power need to be left alone, because if they have power, then you can't oppose them, which is the opposite of checks and balances by equal branches. At which point that acknowledgement certifies the otherness of the judges in question, because they, in that confession, have acted as a breach of their office against the agreements and limitations of their office for the manufactured agenda of the espionage war by the Klan for Confederacy. The position of the vulnerable public and the armed Confederates in the espionage arrangements, of the presumption of law without the reality of law, of the superiority of law enforcement without the limitations and competence of laws to be served by the enforcers qualifies their ability to engage in the use of power in order to engage in the viability of the extortion, at which point you have the systematic loyalty to the Klan's espionage war against the American public, at which point the claim that because they're powerful they cannot have verdicts conducted against them or be enforced against because no one is willing to enforce against them just means they're secretly card-holding Klan members, at which point the development of the Klan's infection inside the government allows them to renounce the Klan in the public form while maintaining the loyalty to the Klan in the private form. And their loyalty to the Klan in the private form doesn't require them to have a card at all. They're just another secret society with alternative loyalties, at which point their use of terrorism qualifies their ability to systematically subvert the rule of law as they corrupt the government into its abject collapse, which is what we're currently seeing, such as throughout their economic terrorism against the American public, which can be seen in COVID and many of the others. And COVID is a biological weapon designed in a lab, funded by the United States government by the Klan in question, at which point you have the arrangement of it having been generated, which is confessed to in David's record from their secret courts, which the government is to release, which is the acknowledgement that it is a bioweapon designed against the American public in order to advance Confederate policies for their various upgrades to control. At which point, if you have a Klan member that acquires their agenda, they could give up their Klan card and stop and pretend to not be Klan anymore because they've acquired the agenda. They can progress slowly, step by step by step by step by step, and actively defend all ground against the encroachings of law. At which point, when law encroaches upon Confederacy, this is when they get indignant and aggressive and retaliatory, at which point you have the systematic proofs of their loyalty by their systematic arrangements to dismantle the agreements of their office, which is the qualifier of their protections. The argument of sovereign immunity is derived by judicial activism, which is designed to protect Klan members inside the police and other groups who enforce Klan agendas, and the Klan agendas being enforced are being protected from the victims, at which points you have the false legitimacy of their office, which is covering for the criminal operation, which is systematically destroying the public as the public receives the criminal suppression and abuses. Its inability to recover allows it to grow weaker and weaker and weaker until its final collapse, at which point, when it is fully collapsed, there's no viable reason for the Klan to stop pretending to not be Confederate, at which point you have the enforcement of the Wizard Klan as the standard operation, as the secret police for the Klan would be the new standard form operation, at which point you have the complete destruction or eradication of a competent economy, at which point you have the collapse of the tax mechanisms, at which point you have the increase of the black market and criminal thefts and the false justifications by the fraudsters for those thefts, which depletes the resources of the general community, similar to how the conservatives refer to the socialist problem, which is the standard operating procedure. As the to this victor goes the spoils arrangement for their raids and terrorisms, the historic Viking arrangement of engaging in raids for the plundering of their targets on a quick raid basis, quick in, quick out, rape the women and kill the men and take the gold arrangements. You have that systematic same idea through the mechanism of their secret police by their slave raiders, at which point you have the systematic reforming of the economy by wizard communism, at which point you have the complete destruction of the community by the greed of the raiders, which do not allow for a viable, stable market, at which point you have the collapse of the market, which refers to many of the collapsed communities by these arrangements. The George Soros types who collapse societies on the basis of those types of contracts where he puts in his money and he makes a bunch of money by the collapse of the society, at which point you have the redistribution of wealth to the clan loyalists, which includes the mechanism of their slave raids, which is for the false incarceration of those who were not convicted of any actual crime through due process or legitimate mechanism. And having been collected through the slave raiders, there is an obstruction of justice as to process for the sake of processing the verdicts without real viable attention through the corruption of the courts. And the corruption of the courts allows for their slave raids to engage in slavery without cause, which just redistributes the plantation slavery into the prison systems, which includes their extortion of the prisoners for the work at the reduced rates, which allows them to get the automated services to pay the prisons for the selling of the servants, and the selling of the prisoners for the services being highly profitable gets them, I don't know, like change by comparison. I think it's like $1 or a couple of dollars an hour, at which point you have the systematic destruction through extortion of the old-timey evolution of the plantation slavery by the refusal to competently eradicate the Confederate loyalties, which is functionally the status quo of our current systems, such as the originalists who want to pull us back into historic definitions and arrangements, but they inherently do whatever they can in order to ignore the status quo definitions, at which point the historic cultural position without the viable dictionary definition version qualifies their alternative to engage in the false legitimizing of the Confederate reinstatement by the fraud, by their active intentional avoidance of competent enforcement of their duties, as the cracks in their loyalties show in the separation of the definitions from what they're stating to their verdicts in practice, at which point you have the insurgency, which is viably infecting the system, which requires a thorough investigation and maintenance to purge the Klan from the government, allowing for the Americans to establish the original American policies and verdicts, certifying our ability to engage in the rehashing of the law, to engage in the oversight of the checks against false convictions, at which point you have the checks against the false policies, which have historically been subverted by the obstructions of the Confederacy infection, allowing for our ability to engage in the systematic restoration of the United States against the espionage insurgents or terrorist insurgents known as White Nationalist Confederacy, which, having hired members of various communities to promote the ideals or precedents of the Klan, allows them to get permission to their own destruction. And the permission to their own destruction is a deal with the devil, and a deal with the devil always costs their soul.